First, some very quick background on C.S. Lewis. He is prominently known not only for this work, Mere Christianity, but The Abolition of Man, and probably most famously known for his works, The Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis was a linguist. He was an English professor. He wrote many, many other books besides the ones I've just mentioned. And he is also trained in the classics, including philosophy. And certainly you can see philosophical arguments in this book, Mere Christianity. This is the first of several videos, and I'm covering here just book one, chapters 1 through 3. Mere Christianity, one more background note, is the result of a series of radio messages that Lewis gave during World War II on the BBC. And about 8 years after that, he put them into a book form. So he edited them somewhat, but it might be helpful to keep in mind that he is writing for a broad audience. So that's his intent. And one final thing to note before we get into the content here, this is book 1 of 4 within the book called Mere Christianity. It's a short book, even though it has 4 books within it. So let's go ahead and get to that content. First of all, just the preface. He considers this question, what is a Christian? And he recognizes certainly that the label Christian has been used in a wide variety of ways. And now in the 21st century, certainly even more ways than it was when he wrote the book. Now, surveys, religionists, those who study religion, will classify anyone who claims to be a Christian, wants to be identified as a Christian. So that's typical in academics, at least. It doesn't really matter what the person actually believes. It doesn't matter how they act. It doesn't matter whether or not they ever go to church. If they say they're a Christian, they're identified as a Christian. Now, Lewis wants to narrow it down just a little bit more than that. And he says that anyone who is a Christian is at the least a person who accepts Christian doctrine. Now, Lewis doesn't specify what Christian doctrine is, at least not in the preface where he's discussing this question. But certainly, and this is my addition here, Christian doctrine that I'm pretty confident Lewis would say ought to be included in one's beliefs would be first that God exists. Of course, you need to be a theist to be a Christian. That Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus was crucified, rose again, and is the way to God for those who believe in him. So that's the idea. A person who believes those things is a Christian. Now, Lewis goes on to talk about then a law of human nature. Maybe we should say the law of human nature. Now, what is this? It's not a natural physical law. So what is it? Well, he starts just by identifying the idea that everyone argues about what is morally right or wrong at some time. And we see this in conversations. We hear it in public discourse. We see this when anyone appeals to principles like, how'd you like it if someone did that to you? Or you owe me a favor, so now it's time to pay me back. Or any other kinds of moral principles like that. We all have a sense of these. And when we argue about what's morally right or wrong, we appeal to a standard of behavior. We're not merely commenting on what we prefer. And certainly when we're responding to a charge of being immoral or being unfair, very few of us claim that the standard in question is not correct. Rather, what we do is we try to say we didn't actually break the standard. So if somebody says, you owe me a favor, the response is not typically, no, there's no such thing as owing favors. The response is typically something like, no, I already paid you back. I already gave you the favor you deserve, something to that effect. Now, if there were no standard of right or wrong, and here's certainly an argument from Lewis, then there may be fights, there may be arguments between people about morality, there may be wars, but no one could actually blame the other side of being morally wrong. So Lewis argues that, for example, in World War II, the Nazis would have been no more morally wrong than the British were. And so there is no standard by which you can claim that one side is morally right or morally wrong. Now let's continue in this exploration of the law of human nature. What we've just seen is evidence that there is a law of human nature. These arguments that we have, these ideas that we have, that there is a standard, and people who fail to meet that standard of morality are in the wrong. And this is actually evident in a wide variety of cultures. Now, certainly, various cultures across history and time and place have different particular principles of morality, but even cultures as disparate as the ancient Egyptians, the Babylonians, Hindu culture, Chinese culture, Greeks, the ancient Romans, they had standards of morality that were very similar to our own in the 21st century. The kinds of things we hinted at when we said something like, you owe me a favor, or how'd you like it if somebody else treated you that way? And those kinds of ideas have been common throughout history and throughout a variety of cultures. So when somebody says that they don't believe in objective moral values or objective moral principles, they often quickly appeal to such principles and values when they are wrong, right? If somebody cheats them, takes advantage of them, betrays them in some way, they're very quick to judge the other person as being wrong. And in order to make a judgment, you have to have a standard. So Lewis says it must be an objective standard because we see the commonalities among all these various cultures. Now, people may be mistaken about what is right or what is morally wrong, just like people sometimes make mathematical errors, but Lewis claims that, look, it's not a mere matter of taste or opinion when we're talking about morality any more than the multiplication table is a matter of taste or opinion. And people make mistakes when they do math, and people make mistakes when they make judgments about morality, but that doesn't mean there is no objective moral standard. Now, a challenge for all of us is that no one fully keeps the law of human nature. We all recognize our failings unless we have some mental defect of some kind, unless we're a sociopath or something like that. We recognize that we sometimes fail to do what we ought to do, morally speaking. And when somebody points out that we're not succeeding in keeping the moral law, we typically respond with excuses, right? A normal, healthy person will respond with excuses. So this is an unusual thing, right? We'll again try to claim that we didn't really break that principle, or the law doesn't apply in this particular situation. And it seems to be a universal idea that humans ought to behave in a certain way. And it seems to be a universal idea that they often fail to behave as they should. Now, Lewis goes on to consider some objections to what he's said so far in chapter 2. So let's consider a few objections here that Lewis brings up. One objection is that, wait a minute, morality is just something enculturated into us. So your culture teaches you certain things are right and certain things are wrong. So it's not objective. It's more like what we would call a herd instinct. Now, Lewis's response to this is just, again, he's asking for some self-reflection. So he says, well, wait a minute, consider somebody crying for help because they are in danger. It could be somebody drowning. It could be somebody in a burning building, or it could be somebody getting mugged, right? Now, you have a desire to help that comes from your herd instinct, right? Presumably on this idea. But you also have a desire for self-preservation, right? If somebody's getting mugged, you don't want to also get harmed in some way by the mugger. If somebody's in a burning building, you don't want to get into the fire and possibly harm yourself that way, right? We have this desire for self-preservation. So now we have two competing instincts, we might say. Lewis says, but wait a minute, when we reflect on this situation, there seems to be a third thing, a third thing that kind of is above these two because it makes a judgment between these two instincts. It tells you what the right thing to do is. And that's what he's calling the moral law. So the moral law would judge you and say you need to help. If there's a chance, a decent probability, you might say, that you can help successfully, you need to do it, right? Now, if it's absolutely impossible, then you may recognize that may not be a time to do it, but then your moral law is telling you there's nothing you could have done. Lewis compares this, makes an interesting comparison. He says, our instincts that we have, maybe the herd instinct, the instinct for self-preservation, they're kind of like notes to play on an instrument. And what the moral law does is it tells us when to play them. So there's a time for self-preservation. There's a time for giving help. And all instincts, that is, putting aside perversion of instincts that might happen, are permissible to fulfill at some time, right? Our desires that we naturally have are permissible to fulfill in the right circumstances. And so it does seem to be that there is this moral principle, this human law, a law of human nature, rather, that is above and beyond something enculturated into us. All right. And as a matter of fact, when we reflect on this, the moral law often tells us to side with the weaker instinct. Now, that doesn't always have to be the case, of course, but sometimes we can tell that there's something above and beyond the two instincts because there's something else saying, no, you should follow the weaker instinct in this case. All right, one other objection, well, we'll consider a couple more, but that the moral law is merely a social convention. It's learned by education. It's learned from parents. It's learned from teachers. And because it's learned, it's clearly a social convention. And Lewis simply denies that last claim. He said, wait a minute, just because something is taught to us doesn't mean it's a human invention. So consider principles of multiplication, mathematical rules. You have to be taught these principles, but that doesn't mean that it's a matter of convention, right? That's not the case. You have to be taught laws of logic, maybe, but that doesn't mean those principles of logic are merely conventions, right? Now, there are certainly some things that are merely conventions. Which side of the road to drive on. Lewis was a Brit, so it'd be left side for him. I'm an American, so it'd be the right side for me. But the moral law is not merely convention in that same way. Again, he kind of brings back this concern. Otherwise, why would one prefer one set of values, like our values, your own 21st century Western values, if you are a 21st century Westerner, or over something like Nazi moralities of the 20th century, right? Some moralities are better than others. If there weren't, the idea of moral reformers would not make sense. Now, that argument is developed very thoroughly by a philosopher, Louis Poyman, and I address that in my videos on relativism and objectivism. This idea that if there are moral reformers, there has to be a morality, a set of values that is better than another set of values. Okay, when we make a judgment that one set of moral rules are better, say equal access among races, for example, to all publicly available resources. They should be equal access. It shouldn't be depend on your race. And you judge that the United States, for example, has a history of not following that principle, then you are measuring the former way that we acted in the United States by an independent, objective standard. And if there were no objective standard, then there's no sense in saying that one culture is morally better or morally worse in particular issues. Even let's take some things that most people recognize as problematic: slavery, ill treatment of women, unjust warfare. Right now, most people would agree Russia's invasion of Ukraine is an unjust war. There is an objective standard that causes us to make this judgment. Okay. One other factor when we're talking about the law of human nature, and that is the reality of the law that Lewis addressed. And he says it's odd that humans have this sense of right behavior and yet a recognition that they don't abide by it, right? Other things in nature aren't like that, right? We don't think it's odd that everybody abides by the law of gravity, and we don't think that we shouldn't abide, that we often fail to abide by it, even though we recognize that we ought to obey it. That just doesn't make sense, right? When it comes to morality, it is a little odd that we have this sense of right behavior, objective moral standards, and yet we recognize we often don't do that. So other things in nature just simply aren't like that. There's something about humans, something that can't be observed simply by the facts of how we behave, that is true here. The reality of the moral law is something that you just can't observe by the facts of how other people treat other people. We often treat other people poorly, and we recognize that goes against the moral law. And what we call good behavior in others is clearly not behavior that happens to be useful to us, right? That's not what we mean. When it comes to good behavior in ourselves, it doesn't mean that that's to our benefit, right? It can be good behavior, again, to help somebody else, even at a cost to yourself. But so that's not what we're talking about here. It has to be an objective moral law that's distinct from that. Now, it's true that societies, somebody might claim, well, societies can't thrive without individual and groups being honest and being fair and being kind to each other. So it's just Lewis didn't put it this way, but it's just an evolutionary development. But he says that doesn't really make sense in terms of an individual basis. That doesn't give you, as an individual, a motive for being honest, fair, and kind to other people, especially if it could be to your advantage not to do those things. And so it just seems that there's more than one kind of reality. There are facts about how people act, but then there's this other reality that we find obligating us to act in certain ways. And Lewis, having started with this idea, is going to take it and say, what does that mean? How can we explain this? How does this fit with Christianity? And that's what we're going to explore as we continue more videos on this topic.